Hello and welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and today's show is going to be rather interesting. I have Kelly Sloan in studio with me. He is a frequent contributor to Colorado Politics, the Washington Examiner, also a frequent contributor to Connect and Collaborate. Kelly, we're excited to have you. We've had you joining us about once a month for the last several months talking about the legislative session. And as we know, it's been a pretty contentious session.
You could say that.
Yeah, to say the least, really. Well, one exciting thing is that we are going to be having Senator Tate join us in the second half of the show. But before we get there, we have a lot to discuss when it comes to this last legislative session. So let's kind of jump into it. How was it? What's your takeaway from it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on again. It's always a pleasure to be here. So you asked a political question. I'll give a political answer. It was a mixed bag. Depends a lot on, what your which side you're coming from. But for both of them, I think the answer would be both sides, Democratic and Republican, would be there were mixed results. Now, obviously, for the Democrats who had I guess you'd call it a super majority, they had the majority in both the House and the Senate this year, along with the governorship. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that that was very much in their favor, that it was very, that their agenda was aggressive and it was aggressively pursued. And for the most part, it's fairly successful. They passed a lot of their big bills, a lot of the ones that were their priorities. But they did have a couple bills that didn't quite go as far as they wanted to, that they had to amend in ways I think that were unfavorable to their ultimate agenda. And a couple that died on the cutting room floor as well. So, and then from, of course, for the Republican side, they were, and the business side for that matter. Again, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that given the political makeup that it was a trying session or a challenging session. But again, the counter works there too. That there were a few successes here and there spotted amongst the many defeats I think that Republicans had this year. But it wasn't all bad.
Well, that being said, I think it's interesting to see. This is the first year that Colorado has swung from purple to blue.
Right.
And so you keep mentioning that there's a lot that the Republicans lost out on, and I don't disagree with that. But the nice thing about this is that the Democrats did come to the table with quite a few amendments, and they did lose a little bit of what they wanted. There were great strides, I think, on both sides this session, which I don't think we thought would happen.
Yeah, there's a couple reasons for that. Now, remember, it wasn't too long ago, 2013, where the Democrats did have the trifecta again. They had the Senate and the House and the governorship. Things were a little different back then. Of course, the governor was viewed by some as more moderate, especially in certain areas, particularly in energy. And I think the Democratic leadership may have been a little more moderate than today. Not so much leadership, perhaps, as some of the rank and file members, I think, pulled the leadership a little bit over to the left somewhat. And as for the more cooperative nature, I dare say some of that was kind of forced towards the end of the session. I don't think you saw quite as much of it near the beginning. I think the best example would be Senate Bill 181, the oil and gas bill. That one was pushed through rather quickly. It was, I want to say, month perhaps from introduction to signature.
Yes.
And there wasn't a lot of negotiation that went into play there. There was essentially the leadership in both the House and the Senate and the governor pretty much telling the Republicans and the industry this is what's going to happen. There wasn't a lot of bringing to the table. Now, some of that I think was just a result of several years of them not getting what they wanted, and they a lot of these people are they were very invested in bringing some reforms to oil and gas development that were geared towards keeping it in the ground. That's hard to reconcile with a pro-development agenda. So after several years of having a governor that was pro-energy development, that he was a geologist, he understood the science behind it, he understood the geology and what the oil industry was all about, and he was willing to work with the industry to bring about some of these reforms that some may have been needed, many probably not. But after several years of that and not really getting the majority of their shopping list, so to speak, I think they had an opportunity now, and to quote somebody from a few years ago, they didn't let it go to waste. So, and they certainly didn't. It's the 181. I'm sure you've talked about on this show plenty of times. We've discussed it a little bit before. I think it's hard to underestimate just how transformative that could be. The two principal components to it that that I've focused on, the local control bit, which of course gives local governments, municipalities, and counties, so forth, the authority to enact further restrictions beyond what the state enacts on oil and gas development, fracking bans, that kind of thing. Interestingly, the local control argument doesn't go the other way. The bill doesn't give local governments the flexibility to perhaps impose less restrictive regimes on their local development. So the whole local control argument kind of cuts both ways, and it's an interesting one that was used a lot this year in a lot of different bills. You saw there was a minimum wage to allow local governments to enact their own minimum wage. You saw one with the rent control to allow local control over rent control. You kind of saw that as a I don't know if you want to call it a weapon, but certainly a tactic.
I would say a theme.
A theme,
yeah.
But I think it was kind of used as, I think there's a messaging component to that as well. I mean, that's always been, and correctly so, a conservative talking point that economic decisions in particular should be made at the lowest feasible level. They've kind of taken that over, and I think the discussion now is where's the word feasible. For instance, I'm a pretty rock-ribbed conservative myself. I don't believe in local control of foreign policy or of trade policy. I don't think, as much as I admire and adore the Mesa County commissioners, for instance, I don't think, and I think they would agree with me, that none of them really want to be in control of our nuclear submarines, for instance. So that's a kind of reductionist argument to make, but you can apply that as well to things like oil and gas development. A lot of these counties aren't really set up to be able to make the downhole decisions that they are now going to be expected to have to make. They don't have the petrophysicists, they don't have the geologists, so on and so forth. But the other part of that bill that I thought was fairly transformative and could be fairly consequential is the change in the role and purpose for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Now, I think we've discussed on here before the purpose of those commissions around the country. They were established back in the early days of the oil patch, back in Pennsylvania, Spindletop, that area where people they discovered you could punch holes in the ground and this really valuable black stuff would come up, but they didn't have any sense of the physics underneath or the geology underneath. So people would punch holes in the same spot to get the same amount of oil. Well, what would happen is those fields would depressurize, and you would end up with 80-90% of the recoverable oil left unrecovered. And that was considered waste because it's such a valuable national resource. So the commissions were set up to kind of map these fields, and that's what the permitting is for, is to make sure that they're not depressurized, so that we as a society get the most use out of our resource. Well, that was considered fostering the oil and gas industry. And what the proponents of 181 did is change that relationship with the industry from fostering to one of prioritizing, before anything else, public health and safety, which sounds great, and I think all of us want to promote public health and safety. That's what the government is there for. However, we have other government agencies that do that. The Colorado Department of Public Health, coincidentally enough, it's written right into its title as being responsible for that. So in one sense, it's kind of putting the cart ahead of the horse, and I guess the other metaphor you could use is a solution in search of a problem. There's numerous studies out there, from the EPA to numerous universities, including some in Colorado here, that point to the safety of oil and gas development, not only human safety and health, but safety to our water supply. There hasn't been a case of fracking, hydraulic fracturing interfering with groundwater or contaminating groundwater. So there wasn't really much of an impetus to do this empirically. They would cite obviously the explosion in Firestone, but one thing that wasn't brought up was that the situations that led to that tragedy were dealt with last session in legislation that dealt with mapping of some of these pipelines, underground pipelines, and going back and looking at some of these abandoned wells and that. So that issue was already dealt with. The 181 had nothing to do with Firestone. So you have that. And then the other big issue is, now who is responsible for fostering the oil and gas industry in the sense of making sure that we are utilizing this resource. And that's a philosophical debate, because we have people, I think much of the leadership in both House and Senate and in the administration don't feel that leaving it in the ground is a waste. They actually believe that oil and natural gas should be left alone. We shouldn't be using it. Unfortunately, they haven't really come up with a plan to use anything else. Renewables for electricity make up barely a quarter of our electrical generation in the state. The rest is coal and natural gas. We don't have too many other options yet for vehicles. We can talk about electrical vehicles later, but of course those right now are coal powered. So so they don't really have a plan. And I think what we're going to see, what we're already seeing, is the industry is going to be responding by saying, look, we've tried, but this is just far too egregious. The overburden in Colorado is just too much for us to work here, and they'll move on. We saw it in the West Slope already with Keras oil and gas. They picked up stakes and moved on. I can tell you the Western Slope can't afford too many of those. Halliburton, I believe, has left Grand Junction. That was a major employer in Grand Junction. There's not much else out there to replace it at this point. So I think we've just started seeing some of the impact from that.
I think you and I would both agree that Colorado is ahead of its game when it comes to oil and gas regulations. They were number one in the nation anyway when it came to state regulations.
Right.
So essentially, again, to reiterate what you were saying, we are moving this to more local governments. I think one of the things that we might see an issue with is some counties that are already thriving on the oil and gas industry will continue to do so. There are other counties, say, I don't know, Boulder County,
right.
That are probably going to restrict down to no drilling at all.
Sure.
And so I see your point here of saying that those companies that are trying to drill here in Colorado are going to find it as too hard, really, to try to fight local governments in order to make money, right?
Well, and here's where it comes down to, that the local government argument is a little disingenuous in some sense. Again, they're not allowing local governments the flexibility to perhaps have a little more permissive or a little more less restrictive regulatory environment. So Weld County or Garfield County or Rio Blanco County is still bound by whatever the state does. And what those three counties and others, Yuma, there's several others, may be very welcoming to oil and gas, but you got to remember, those fields don't recognize municipal and county boundaries. There's a reason that a lot of those decisions are made at the state level, and so that's going to reverberate down through the industry. It'd be one thing if it could, these decisions could stay in Boulder County, and Boulder County could be its own little biosphere and be all organic and non-GMO, non-vaccine, non-everything, whatever it wants to be, and just leave everybody else alone. But it doesn't work like that. We're an integrated economy, and that's why, when we say that decisions ought to be made at the lowest feasible level, well, that's, in terms of oil and gas, the most feasible level for those downhole decisions. Keep in mind, counties and municipalities already have control over land use decisions and zoning, things like that. The stuff that they can handle. But I think the larger question there is not just the local government piece, but the COGCC piece, changing that relationship, and also the fact that permits are going to be a lot harder to come by now, and no permits are And there may have been some amendments to the bill to kind of ease up on this a little bit, but in the initial iteration of the bill, permits were not going to be decided on any kind of technical basis whatsoever. I think they eased up on that a little bit, but the problems that operators are going to have with getting permits from the state, whether you're in Weld County or Boulder County or anywhere else, those aren't going to go away, and those are going to cause some pretty serious issues with the industry in the state. And it's going to be interesting to see how it reacts. It'll be particularly interesting to see how Anadarko, one of our largest oil companies, now that it's been essentially taken over by Occidental in a major acquisition, how they're going to respond to it. Now, I think we've already seen how smaller operating companies, Keras, some of the others, simply don't have the resources to be able to handle the overhead that's just been put on them. Maybe some of the larger companies can. Maybe it won't be worth their while if they can go down to Midland, Texas, or North Dakota, or God forbid, overseas. So that'll be interesting.
It will be interesting. We have a lot more bills to cover, and in just a short amount of time. One of these that I definitely want to make sure we touch on is this paid family leave. That was a huge impact on the business community. So
absolutely. So the what the Family Act would do, Senate Bill 188, it would have created a state-run family leave program. It was going to be funded. It was 12 weeks, full 12 weeks for taking care of, and it was a fairly broad definition of family member and what you could
which this day and age is necessary, I believe. There are lots of blended families, lots of different definitions of families for people, and so I actually don't have a problem with that, but I understand that a gray area means more time in a courtroom. Typically.
Well, where that comes into play is to how it's going to be utilized. Right. Well, let's touch on that in a second. But essentially what it did is requires employers and employees to pay into this system. They didn't call it a tax, so it wouldn't have had to go to the taxpayer, but it was a payroll tax. Initially a 60-40 employer-employee split, amended to 50-50. And like you said, it faced some pretty serious opposition from the business community, as you can imagine, which was now going to be faced. And one thing you need to, I think it's important to know about this bill, was it would apply to any business of any size. Mine, which is, despite the name Sloan and Associates, I have no associates. I have about as many associates as I have friends. And I'm one man shop. From the mom and pop restaurant that hires themselves maybe one or two other people, all the way up to a larger business. There are other, I won't even call them similar programs around the country because they're very dissimilar. I don't think any of the other ones started in any other state required an employee or employer buy-in, the employer to contribute to this. So, but I don't think any of them also had that other component about I lost my train of thought, but it was with the size of business. I think all of them were kind of patterned on the federal FMLA Family Medical Leave Act, which limited it. The size. It was only the mid-size and large. So the smallest of the small businesses weren't going to be burdened with this. And it's not just the tax that they have to pay per person, but it's the fact that now you're losing somebody for 12 weeks. And for a larger business, okay, you can probably you can adjust. Within.
There's temp agencies. You have more employees to choose from if someone needs to pick up a few more tasks.
If you have 5 employees, they probably all have a particular job to do. That's a lot harder to. A lot harder to accommodate, especially when you have, they're now being paid for not being there, and you've now got to pay somebody else to fulfill their job, and then the cost that kind of inherent with training somebody to do that job only temporarily. So there were a lot of issues with it. One of the biggest issues came about when REMI, the economic modeling company, did a study that put to question not only a lot of the assumptions, and the biggest assumption I think that the proponents were making that seemed rather off base was the utilization rate. I think they were assuming a far lower utilization rate than most observers, and indeed this analysis pointed out would be used. I mean, it was a very generous benefit, and it's, if nothing else, human nature that if you're given a generous benefit, you're going to use it. And it was written broadly enough that, and I know what they were trying to do. You know, if you have a sick husband, you just gave birth, your wife just gave birth, you know, you're trying to take care of your mother, and that does create a substantial financial burden. But it is written broadly enough that I think many people could have taken advantage of it. And I think the utilization rate, even if it was lower than what the REMI report stated, was still threatening insolvency of the program within a few short years. So kind of like another pair, which we really don't need. So all those together, the opposition from the business community, which is fairly unified, this report, and on top of that, the timing, all those kind of conspired to forcing the bill sponsors to come back to the table. And essentially what happened was it was transmogrified into a study. It was risking death on the calendar. One thing we'll talk a little bit with Senator Tate when he comes in about this, but one of the very few arrows that the Republicans had in their quiver was being able to use the calendar to their advantage. And fortunately, for the Republicans within their leadership, they had some people that were very adept at knowing the process, knowing the procedure, and being able to use that time management to their advantage. So that all worked to kind of force the bill sponsors to say, okay, well, let's turn this into a study. Now opinions differ on how tendentious the study may be. It's I think it's kind of written towards bring the same bill back next year. It's written towards bring a bill next year. And it's creating a task force that I think it won't take very much tactical knowledge on the part of Democratic leadership to be able to stack to get the result they're looking for. So it's a delayed battle is what that one is. So that's one that we'll be fighting again next year.
It is a delayed battle, but I do think that bringing it back down to a study, considering the fact that we didn't have enough information to bring to the table on making sure that we know exactly how much is coming from the employer versus the employee. We want to know exactly, are we defining, can I take that 12 weeks off because my dog had surgery, right?
Right.
That's family, right? That to me, that is very important. That dog is very important to it is a family member. But that being said, is it necessary for me to take 12 weeks off?
Sure.
So I think reducing this down to a study is a nice compromise in the long run.
It was a great compromise, and you know, and don't get me wrong, Senators Winter and Williams are to be commended and honored for taking that step. I know I don't think they wanted to. I think again this was a major agenda item for the Democrats, so they are to be honored for doing that. We'll just see how that turns out. We will see how that turns out. Unfortunately, we have to take a quick break, but excitingly, we are going to have Senator Tate joining us in the second half. So stay with us here on Connect and Collaborate. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page. We're going to continue this conversation on this legislative session and how really crazy it was. There were a lot of bills on the table. It got crazy in there. We had the calendar that was knocking on the door. So we're going to talk more about that. Again, Senator Tate will be joining us in the second half. So stay with us here on Connect and Collaborate. You can find this podcast and more at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. Once again, I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and we are here with Senator Jack Tate and Kelly Sloan of Sloan & Associates, also frequent contributor to Colorado Politics, Washington Examiner, and Connect and Collaborate. So I'm super excited that you're joining us, and I'm even more surprised that Kelly, as a frequent contributor to media, was able to get a legislator in here.
I happen to be close by. Very serendipitous.
Yes. Well, we appreciate you joining us. As you know, this was a pretty contentious legislative session. There was a lot going on, a lot of wheels turning. We have a brand new leadership. We're all blue now. You are not blue. You are red. You are a Republican senator. So we have some great questions for you for joining us and talking about these bills.
Well, let's talk about it. It's an exciting time. A lot of bills came through the session this year, and a lot came through in the last week.
Yes, which is fun to say. I think that was probably intentional on both parties' parts.
I would imagine that's true. Complex legislation is subject to procrastination, just like a high schooler wants to put off the term paper. And so there's always more stakeholdering, more negotiation, and it's funny how the calendar can just kind of sneak by you as you're working on that. Additionally, a lot of times there's big legislation that happens in the last week under the cover of safety of numbers of all the other things going on to, as I imagine, minimize controversy. And then, of course, finally, as we know, there was some delays going on in the legislative calendar, which meant there was a little backlog the last 5 days.
Yeah, so I thought eventually we would all grow out of procrastination, but it doesn't seem to miss any industries that procrastination stays with us.
Well, true. I mean, there's always opportunity to make things better, and the legislative process involves a lot of people. And I think my sense is, from my role being legislator, I never assume I know what I don't know. And so an additional conversation or two is always helpful. And then finally, as we know, the notion of including people in the conversation is very important. One of the grave sins you can commit as a legislator is not include stakeholders in some conversations. And as a matter of fact, I was having a conversation at lunch today with one of Denver's business leaders, and they felt like the business community overall was kind of, their voice wasn't considered to the degree it should, considering the impact several pieces of legislation had on the business community.
I would probably agree that there are a lot of business leaders out there that feel pretty snubbed at this point.
That's true.
Yeah. Kelly, I know that you've got some wonderful questions here for Senator Tate, if you don't mind.
No, of course. Well, so of course, by way of background, we all know Senator Tate is well regarded amongst the state's business community as being one of its foremost advocates legislatively. He was also the chair of the Business, Labor, and Technology Committee in happier days, and a long-serving member. To that end, in your analysis, Senator, how would you rate the success of the Democratic majority in advancing its agenda this session, and compared to the Republican minority's success in frustrating it to some degree?
Well, I think they're both connected in some ways. The Democrat agenda was very comprehensive, and I would say very aggressive, going after areas in labor employment, healthcare, energy and environment, as well as just tax issues. And I was surprised that even beyond some of the stated campaign goals they had, frankly, environmental issues was number one. They also brought in things like the national popular vote, which I remember over a week-long controversy, some legislators saying, hey, why are we doing this? No one even campaigned on this thing. So I would say overall a very ambitious legislative agenda by the Democrats. And I would have to say overall, when you have that big an agenda, then anything we've done on the Republican side to mitigate that is also significant in proportion. But I would say if you're a Democrat, just knowing all the different areas of law they touched, you have to come away feeling like, for better or worse for the business community, better or worse for the economy and jobs, et cetera, that they have to feel that we're successful in their goals. And I think from our end, because of what we did and knowing how ambitious their agenda was, we feel pretty satisfied in having successfully pared back some things.
Well, as you mentioned, they did a lot of things this session. The national popular vote was certainly interesting and, as you mentioned, unexpected, and facing quite a substantial backlash in the state right now. As a matter of fact, it looks like it'll probably get their signatures to get it. There's an initiative right now to undo that. But of the bills that were passed, and I think most of the agenda was pursued in the first half of the session, which ones do you think we're going to have the greatest impact on the state, particularly long-term, which are going to be the most consequential?
Well, I'll just focus on maybe just the business context, since this is a business show. Nothing like knowing your audience a little bit.
Love that.
Obviously, the oil and gas legislation is probably number one. That has to do with, from a business perspective, the degree to which the legislation will change the capital investment appetite within the oil and gas industry. And so, capital investment's funny. It's, it is to some degree a rational financial decision. It's based on rational financial models, cost of capital, cash flows, things like that. But, one aspect to modeling is regulatory uncertainty and if things could get worse, and what does the legislation today mean towards the industry's financial models of the future. If they make those models look red, then investment will go somewhere else. And with capital investment goes the jobs. A significant proportion of jobs in that sector are related to oil and gas development, not just accounting for past development as gas and oil and natural gas are brought out of the ground. So I'd say it's probably number one in terms of the business community effect. And I think I've read that there is some freezing in terms of capital investment activity in the sector. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. I think from the Democrat perspective, to be fair, I think they view the local control as strictly a local issue. But, like I said, capital investment goes where the investors want to go, where they perceive a better long-term climate. And, if I can just look at the Democrats' view charitably, they just may be naive about capital investment behavior. But, we'll see.
If you would both indulge me for a moment, talking about this, I know that across the globe we're talking a lot about renewable energies and moving into that sector. Tons of countries around the world are being applauded for their efforts, 100% green, right? 100% renewables, things like that. I know that Colorado thrives on the oil and gas industry. Quite
Right.
honestly, a lot of our economy depends on that, and I understand that, and I totally get that. But wouldn't you say that we're kind of looking more towards the future if we are if we're changing the rules here with the oil and gas? Thoughts on that?
Well, that presumes what the effect on the future is related to renewable energy investments versus, by the way, the most sensible investment if you're looking at reducing all greenhouse gases, assuming perfect knowledge of their contribution to climate change, would be nuclear power. And we say that's not really in the works. And so one aspect to the Senate Bill 181, which is part of politics, is it's one interest group, gang of interest groups versus the other party. And so you can't look at some bills without knowing, hey, one party is going after the economic base of their opposition. And so that's also part of the mix we have to look at. But with regarding renewable energy investments, there's a certain game theory component, because anything we reduce here, again, under perfect knowledge of what the future holds, Asia, if they don't cooperate, then it means that possibly we're in a situation of higher costs for energy and no change to the problem in the future.
Awesome.
Well, and we saw in 1261, there was actually a fair bit of climate-related legislation that was introduced. A lot of the bills had various bits and pieces of each other incorporated in them, and some of them got melded into one. A lot ended up in the last few days, as you know, Senator, into the PUC sunset, kind of a must-pass bill. So you stack stuff in there that may not otherwise pass.
That would be the last hour, Kelly.
Yeah.
That was the last hour, yeah.
And that's one of the few examples of pork. I saw, you always hear about pork barrel politics in Washington, where Representative Simmons is bringing pork back to his county in southern Kentucky or whatever. This is actually, you don't really hear pork too much, except in this case, it was a pork offering for XL Energy and Black Hills Power.
Right.
That addition, and how they can conduct their cost recovery activities. So it's a fascinating example of how, going back to our previous commentary, that what can happen in the last minute when the appetite of resistance or a greater loss of appetite for any awareness of what's going on comes into play, and the bill just goes through.
Well, and one bill that was kind of folded into that as well was Representative Hansen's bill that would what do they call it? The Colorado Energy Assistance Act, which essentially would allow bonding as an incentive for coal plants to shut down, and then use that money ostensibly to retrain the workers that they're putting out of work. So, to put it in simpler terms, you have the state that's taking away somebody's job and then trying to pay a bunch of money to train them into another job. Why not just leave it alone? So, I mean, you had some of that. With 1261, you touched on some of the green energy and renewables and that. That's one that passed, in the waning hours of the session as well, which sets some fairly aggressive targets for zero emissions in the state across the board. That's gonna cover everything: vehicle fuels, electrical generation, so on and so forth. I guess my problem with bills like that is that those are kind of used as guidelines for other things. We have the zero emission vehicle standards now that are being considered. Last Friday, the Air Quality Control Commission decided to go ahead with the hearing to impose the California zero emission vehicle mandate on Colorado. And one thing that they use to justify that is that, well, we're going towards a zero energy, probably zero energy, but zero emission environment, zero emission.
Well, the good
economy.
news is you can make electrons a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, you absolutely
that's
can.
the silver lining, I
Yeah.
suppose, as we're restructuring the auto industry, possibly. But I do want to go back to some other business stuff. Y'all talked about the family leave bill already?
Yes.
So, just my concerns are it wasn't, besides the having worked with passed the PARA legislation last year and being very sensitive to insolvency issues, that was probably a big concern, and y'all went through that. The other thing is, anytime you're taxing productivity, which it was an income tax up to a certain income threshold, you start to wonder, what does that mean in terms of our small businesses and entrepreneurs? Many folks who are fully leveraged and may have negative net worth, but are still relying on income to pay off their, to conduct their debt service. And so I'm glad y'all covered that. There are several bills in the healthcare sector, which I think some observers look at these little bills that look rather innocuous on their own, but some feel that is really kind of setting the groundwork for single payer in the coming years. And then finally, something I worked on with Representative Kraft Tharp, who did most of the heavy lifting, was bills related to sales and use tax simplification. One bill that went through was related to funding a software tool to help businesses with compliance. And then secondly, the bigger bill related to tax simplification was to provide a little safe harbor for some businesses in some areas and provide guidance on for businesses within our very, very complicated sales and use tax environment in Colorado, what needs to happen with regards to the Wayfair decision. And so that was that was a bill that took a lot of stakeholdering, and it went through in the last couple of days itself.
That was House Bill 1240.
That was House Bill 1240, and that was an excellent thing to get through for small business. So very happy about that one. And one thing I do want to say, it's business related too, is in the legislature we have a unique inability to save for rainy days, and our unemployment insurance trust fund is underfunded by $374 million. So wouldn't it be nice when we have billion-dollar surpluses over year that are actually putting money in the unemployment insurance trust fund, so when we are in a recession, laid-off workers have access to money without state lawmakers scrambling to raid other funds to maintain those obligations. So that's probably my number one, knowing the Democrats' perspective on business. That's probably my number one frustration, is a lack of rainy day funding, considering how much money we have. And one extension of that would be to save money and have all the physical capital projects by the state happen in recessionary times, where projects and buildings, et cetera, IT projects are purchased at a lower rate. Secondly, it becomes like a Colorado GDP stabilizer. So Just want to get through that list real quick to kind of make sure we put those out there, since this is more than just oil and gas industry, if that makes sense.
Yes, it is. And I appreciate you saying that, because it is. We've been bragging about our low unemployment rates for a couple of years now, and it's been all wonderful and great. But at some point, there is going to be a recession. We're due for one, quite honestly. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. We need that rainy day fund. Everyone should have one personally. There's nothing wrong with the state also making sure that we have that. And also, congratulations on that tax simplification with you and Tracy Kraftarp, who's been on the show to talk about that in full detail. That tax simplification, I think that's one way that we saw how local governments can really mess with the system if we give full power to local governments. That sales tax, right? If you purchase something in Grand Junction and I'm in Aurora and I've ordered that, I'm subject to do different tax codes. Yeah,
depending if it's home rule or not, or all that, all those factors are involved. And so in the legislation, we had to make some decisions on where the tax liability is between home rule and non-home rule, and some different situations like that. I should say Tracy had to make a lot of those executive decisions before the bill's introduced.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and we have had her on before, speaking of this issue, which is a huge one for Colorado business owners, particularly small business owners. And as I understand it, that bill kind of dealt with that sourcing rule and provided a little, actually a fair bit of certainty and going forward.
And it provided a $100,000 exemption from the destination sourcing for small businesses who would be better able to pay taxes on an origin sourcing basis.
Well, I'm glad you brought that bill up, and the other sales tax bill, simplification bill you spoke of, Senate Bill 006, I believe that was.
Correct.
I'm glad you brought those up, because one thing I wanted to mention was we talked about some of the successes we've had in kind of turning some of these bigger, more egregious bills into studies, and there's a couple also that were killed. The rent control bill thankfully was killed. I'd like to credit the column I wrote about that on it, but I don't think my 9 readers really had that much of a
I was number 10, and that was a reason.
That would do it.
I would say there's lots of bills this session just like that. Landlord-tenant relationship issues, mobile home parks, things like that, where even the family leave bill, you can look at this to some degree. There's always anecdotal challenging situations where people are getting the shaft or are facing challenges that are atypical of normal Coloradans. So the question always is, what do you do? Should you do anything? And sometimes the blunt instrument of the state is pretty blunt. A lot of times I always get concerned, and the local minimum wage bill that passed is very much in line with that. You can get a situation where you're hurting those you're trying to help by indirectly raising costs for everyone else while you're trying to help a small subsection of the overall affected base of people. And so, like in a landlord-tenant situation, deposits and rents go up if you change what the relationship are between those two parties. Local minimum wage goes up, prices go up, job quantities go down, and then of course many folks on minimum wage are also consuming things that will be then subject to those higher prices. So it is it's a difficult area, and I just saw lots and lots of bills navigating that environment where we're kind of hoping that the negative effects broadly don't outweigh some of what they perceive are the targeted effects they're trying to achieve in the legislation. My view from an economics perspective, usually the negative effects always swamp the benefits you have in mind.
Well, that's the principal economic lesson, I think, that and really that stands with any kind of price control, whether it's minimum wage, rent control, single-payer health care, you name it. There was a couple other bills that did die. One was died on the calendar late, was a polystyrene ban for restaurants. That's styrofoam containers. And we saw earlier in the year a straw ban bill. that one wasn't actually too bad. I think we spoke about that a little bit, that it kind of left it up to the individual restaurants and that. So
kind of bummed about that. I'd bought 300 tons of styrofoam and had it stored in a warehouse. So much for my long position on styrofoam.
You know, that's what you gonna do. Well, and interestingly enough, the restaurants actually introduced that bill. They were in favor of that bill.
The straw bill.
The straw bill.
Yeah.
And it was surprising to see. I like that it was left up to them to decide if they want to offer that.
Well, again, I mean, I think it's another one of those that's kind of a solution in search of a problem. I mean, I think we all get that plastic pollution in the oceans is a huge issue. The United States is responsible for less than 1% of it, and straws are a minuscule percentage of that. So what are we actually really trying to solve? It was a statement
Kelly,
bill.
Small steps.
Well, there's a difference between a small step and kind of a reduction of statement.
I don't like straws typically, so I'm glad I'm not going to have to be offered any.
You're totally fine with it.
But in terms, I just want to say real quick, in terms of successes, in addition to the 2 sales tax bills, we did see here and there a couple other little ones. I know, well, one that moment of personal privilege I was helping work on was the reestablishment of the fertilizer exemption for farmers. That was kind of a weird story. That was always an exemption as a crop input. It was one of those ones that was lost in the Dirty Dozen tax increases of 2013. Senator Sonnenberg and Representative John Becker, brought that back. Because of an audit earlier this year, the Department of Revenue made the unique interpretation of the rule to say that it didn't really apply. So we got that fixed in the last few days. So that was good to see. And there was also a bill to, I can't believe we need this, but to legalize lemonade stands.
That was my favorite bill of the session.
I'm sure it was. I think we all kind of looked at that and thought, really? Are we having people talk on this? Really?
Well, hey, there's nothing wrong with getting kids aware that they can have some control of their own economic destiny, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it was probably one of the most fun times I've had in my 5 years there, having an Ameritown trade show, having the kids come testify. Some of them wore suits at the hearing. It was a fun time.
Well, yeah, those are our business leaders. Those are our future business leaders.
Right.
So let's instill that in them now.
Right, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to get started. This country, quite simply, was built on business. Let's be real. And so if we want our future to continue and have good economies, let's make sure that our kids are well informed about how business works and how legislation works with business. So I think passing that was amazing, and I'm very excited for that.
It was great.
Yeah.
Well,
Gosh, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say. So, I mean, in our last minute, I think your listeners need to know that it doesn't really end entirely in the interim. There's still a lot going on. There's interim study committees. I know they're going to be looking at tax expenditures. That's going to be a huge discussion, I think, over in the next year. And I guess my last quick question. I know, Senator Tate, you made a 25-year career in evaluating and managing projects related to capital investment. You were talking about capital investment, the impact on it from the oil and gas bill. Did they ask your input on as a capital investment expert?
The funny thing is, I was not, as someone who's been involved in financial modeling, the other legislators did not ask.
Well, there you have it. Thank you.
Should say the Democrats didn't ask.
The Democrats didn't ask. I appreciate you clarifying that. Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure. Never enough time to discuss all we need to. So be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube page while you're here. Find this podcast more at cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.